This is You're Next, a Shiver Audiobooks production.
Chapter 1. The Digital Gallows. The silence of Westbridge City was usually punctuated only by the low, rhythmic hum of the wind turbines bordering the northern plains. Tonight, however, that silence felt heavy, suffocating. It was 3:14 a.m., the hour when the world feels most fragile. Jerry Rodriguez sat at his desk, his eyes burning from hours of staring at code, scrolling through encrypted logs that shouldn't exist. A half-empty bottle of cheap bourbon sat to his left, untouched for the last 3 hours. To his right lay his laptop, a modified rig that looked like a tangled nest of copper wires and heat sinks. He wasn't supposed to be here. He was supposed to be in New York, chasing Pulitzer-worthy leads, not rotting in a mid-sized Rust Belt city like Westbridge. But 5 years ago the army had chewed him up and spat him out, and 3 years ago journalism had done the same. He had been embedded with the 10th Mountain Division in Kandahar, a young reporter with an idealistic streak wide enough to drive a tank through. He'd seen the ugly side of clean operations, the collateral damage, the backroom deals, the way power brokers traded human lives like commodities. When he tried to break a story about a high-ranking officer selling intelligence to private contractors, the military didn't court-martial him. They just blacklisted him. His editors folded, his sources evaporated, and his career was quietly erased. He had come to Westbridge to disappear, but he'd brought his cynicism and his skills with him. Now that same skill set was keeping him alive. His phone, a burner he'd scrubbed clean 3 days ago, vibrated against the desk. It wasn't a call, it was a notification. The screen flared to life, casting an eerie blue pallor over his face. Message received. Sender unknown. Text You're Next. Jerry didn't flinch. He didn't gasp. He simply tapped the screen to open the message. It was a standard SMS, but the metadata was encrypted with a level of sophistication he hadn't seen outside of state-sponsored intelligence agencies. This wasn't a prank. This was a death warrant. He leaned back, the leather of his chair creaking in the stillness. He thought of the others. Mrs. Gable, the librarian, found with her car door open and her purse on the seat, engine still warm, no sign of a struggle. Sheriff Miller's son, a high school athlete who vanished on a run, just a pair of abandoned running shoes on the side of the highway. And all the others. The police called them runaways or missing persons cases with no leads. But Jerry saw the pattern. They weren't missing, they were being harvested. He opened a file on his second monitor, a map of the county. He had spent the last 72 hours tracking the cellular pings associated with the disappearances. They didn't go to the local towers. They were routed through a series of ghost servers before bouncing to a high-frequency satellite array located in the abandoned grain silo district on the outskirts of the city. Jerry pulled his tactical vest from under the desk, the weight of it familiar and grounding. He checked the magazine of his Glock 19. A weapon he'd liberated from a black market dealer who didn't need it anymore. He'd spent his life looking for the truth, and he had finally found it. As a game. A sick, twisted billionaire's game of hunting humans for sport. His phone buzzed again. A second message. Sender unknown. Text the forest is waiting, Jerry. Don't keep them in suspense. A dark, humorless laugh escaped his lips. He wasn't prey. He was an auditor, and he was about to deliver a very final review. He grabbed his coat, slung his gear bag over his shoulder, and walked to the window. Across the street, the flickering neon sign of a 24-hour diner buzzed rhythmically. It was all so mundane, so terrifyingly normal, unaware that the predator was already inside the perimeter. He pulled a secure satellite phone from his pocket and punched in a number he had memorized long ago. A number that belonged to a man who lived for the fight. A man who, like Jerry, had been discarded by the machine he once served. Harold, Jerry said as the line connected, his voice steady. It's time to stop the clock. Jerry? The voice on the other end was gravel, weary, and immediately alert. You sound like you've been digging again. I found the grave, Harold. It's a big one, and they just sent me the invitation." There was a heavy pause on the other end, the sound of wind whipping against a microphone. Harold Evans wasn't a man for small talk. "Are we talking about the disappearances in Westbridge?" "We are, and the people responsible are looking for a hunt. I think it's time we showed them what happens when you hunt something that bites back." "I'm 3 hours out," Harold replied, his tone shifting into the cold, clinical professionalism that had made him a legend in the SEAL teams. "What do you need?" "Everything," Jerry said, walking to his truck. "Bring the hardware. We're heading to the silo." He hung up, threw the phone into the passenger seat of his beat-up Ford and turned the ignition. The engine roared, a guttural sound that cut through the silence of the night like a gunshot. As he pulled out onto the empty street, he saw a black SUV parked 2 blocks away, its headlights dark. They were already watching. Jerry slammed his foot onto the gas. He had a job to do. He was the only one who knew the rules, and tonight he was going to break the board. Chapter 2: The Ghost of the Seals. The rendezvous point was an abandoned lumber mill, 10 miles outside the city limits, nestled deep within a thicket of pine trees that seemed to swallow sound. It was the kind of place where a man could disappear, or where he could orchestrate a war. Jerry pulled his truck into the shadow of a rusted loading dock, the gears grinding in protest. He didn't kill the engine immediately. Instead, he scanned the perimeter, his hand hovering over the Glock 19 tucked into his waistband. He saw nothing but the swaying branches and the oppressive darkness of the woods. Then, from the gloom, a silhouette materialized. It moved with a fluid, predatory grace that betrayed a lifetime of elite training. Harold Evans. He wore a matte black tactical jacket, and even in the dim moonlight, Jerry could see the familiar, calm intensity in his eyes. Harold didn't look like a man who had retired to a quiet cabin. He looked like a man who had been waiting for the world to need him again. Harold approached the driver's side door, his hand resting on the holster of his sidearm. He didn't speak until he had checked the truck's blind spots. "You're late," Harold said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "And you're still twitchy," Jerry retorted, opening the door and stepping out into the cold night air. "Habit," Harold replied, offering a faint, grim smile. "I assume you didn't bring me out here for a scenic tour of the Rust Belt. Talk." Jerry leaned against the hood, crossing his arms. He pulled his laptop from the cab and popped it open. The screen lit up, displaying a series of satellite thermal maps of a desolate area 20 miles north, the Silo District. "It's not just kidnappings, Harold. It's an industry," Jerry said, his voice tight. "I've been tracking the digital breadcrumbs for 3 months. Every time someone vanishes in Westbridge, the local cell towers record a microburst of encrypted data. It doesn't go to the network provider. It goes to a proprietary satellite array disguised as an industrial grain storage facility." Harold leaned over, squinting at the screen. He pointed at a cluster of heat signatures around the central silo. "Thermal sensors, perimeter lasers. That's not a grain silo. That's a fortress." "Exactly," Jerry said. "The organization calls itself the Hunters. I've got names, though. Most of them are shell corporations tied to a holding company called Aegis Dynamics. The figurehead is a tech mogul named Richard Stryker. And the muscle? I traced a mercenary contract back to a guy named Elijah the Wolf Perez. He was dishonorably discharged from the Legion 2 years ago for excessive force. He's the one running the field operations." Harold's jaw tightened. The name Perez meant something to anyone who had served in the Shadow Ops community. It meant bodies left in the wake of a mission. "Stryker?" Harold muttered. "I've heard the name. Silicon Valley elite. Supposedly a visionary. Apparently his vision includes hunting people for sport. He calls it the preservation of the apex instinct," Jerry said, his voice dripping with venom. "They trap people in that facility, turn off the grid and hunt them like animals. The rich pay millions to pull the trigger, and today they sent the text to me." Harold looked at Jerry, his gaze sharpening. "But now you're on to them." "They want me to be," Jerry said. "They're bored, Harold. They've hunted the librarians and the kids. Now they want someone who can actually fight back. They think I'm going to be the main event. Harold reached into his duffel bag and pulled out a suppressed hand KMP5, checking the chamber with a rhythmic clack, clack. Then let's give them a show they won't forget. If we're going to hit them, we don't go in through the front door. We find the blind spot in their security grid. I've already found it, Jerry said, turning the laptop toward Harold. Their facility runs on a proprietary mesh network. If I can get close enough to bridge the connection with this interceptor, I can loop the security footage and disable the electronic locks on the containment pens. And if you get caught while you're uploading? Then I'm just another trophy for Stryker's wall. Harold nodded, a grim determination setting over his features. Load up. We move on foot from here. The terrain is thick and I suspect Perez has motion sensors buried in the tree line. We move in stealth, stay low, and we don't engage until we're inside the perimeter. Once we're in, we don't just stop the game. We eliminate the players. Jerry grabbed his gear, a heavy sense of purpose settling into his bones. They were no longer the hunted. They were the wolves creeping back into the fold. As they slipped into the forest, the wind carried a faint mechanical drone, the sound of a surveillance drone patrolling the skies above the silo. Jerry glanced at the sky, his grip tightening on his rifle. The game had begun, and for the first time in years he felt alive. Harold, Jerry whispered as they skirted a ridge overlooking the valley. If we die in there, make sure you take down as many of them as possible before the end. Harold looked back, his face a mask of iron. Jerry, we aren't going in there to die. We're going in there to make sure they do. Chapter 3. The Devil's Playground. The wind outside Westbridge City didn't just blow, it bit. It carried the scent of rain and wet asphalt, but as they crept closer to the grain silo district, the air changed. It became sterile, laced with the sharp, metallic tang of ozone and high-voltage electricity. Harold held up a closed fist, bringing their movement to a complete statuesque halt. They were kneeling in a patch of tall, dead grass, looking down a slight embankment toward the facility. From a distance, it looked like a cluster of decommissioned agricultural structures, rusty steel cylinders and overgrown warehouses. But through Jerry's thermal optics, the reality was terrifying. The silos were merely aesthetic shells. Beneath them, heat signatures pulsed with rhythmic intensity, indicating a massive subterranean complex that extended for acres under the seemingly barren plains. The fence line wasn't chain link, it was reinforced tungsten mesh, glowing faintly with an active electrical current. Laser tripwires every 6 feet, Harold whispered, his voice barely audible over the rustle of the prairie grass. And I count 3 thermal cameras mounted on the perimeter posts. They aren't just protecting a silo, Jerry. They're protecting a fortress. That's because they aren't storing grain in there, Jerry muttered, adjusting his glasses. He pulled a compact, handheld deck from his rig, a modified signal interceptor that hummed with quiet, electric potential. They're storing people. How do we get through? I can blow the fence, but the alarm will hit the central hub instantly. You don't blow it, Jerry said, sliding forward on his stomach until he reached the base of the fence. He tapped a localized EMP pulse device onto the tungsten mesh. I jumped the signal. I'm going to flood their system with a loop of static. It'll look like a hardware glitch on their monitors. You have 10 seconds to get us both through that gap before the security grid reboots. Harold didn't argue. He positioned himself, weapon raised, eyes scanning the perimeter. Do it. Jerry pressed the button. For a heartbeat, the hum of the fence died. The red indicator lights on the security cameras flickered and went dark. Go, Jerry hissed. They moved with the synchronized precision of men who had spent years training for the impossible. Harold vaulted the fence, landing in a silent crouch on the other side, and immediately swept the area. Jerry followed, his gear bag heavy on his back, scrambling through the gap just as the fence began to hum back to life. They were inside. The interior of the preserve was unlike anything Jerry had imagined. It wasn't a sterile lab or a standard military bunker. It was a brutalist design, concrete walls softened by artificial lighting, corridors that looked like high-end hunting lodges, and a massive central atrium that opened up to the night sky. They pressed themselves against the side of a massive loading bay door. From just inside they heard the echo of boots on polished concrete and the low, authoritative bark of a voice. "Zero room for error tonight, gentlemen." Jerry and Harold peeked around the edge of the bay. In the center of the atrium stood Elijah the Wolf Perez. He looked exactly as the dossiers described, clean-shaven, eyes like shards of broken glass, and wearing a tactical vest that was a testament to his mercenary lifestyle. He was addressing a group of men, wealthy, arrogant-looking individuals in expensive, camouflaged hunting gear, but they held top-tier rifles, their scopes gleaming under the LED lights. "The objective is simple," Perez continued, pacing in front of them. "The prey is already in the holding cells. We release them into the northern quadrant in 30 minutes. You have until dawn. The last man standing with the most trophies wins the purse. No rules, no mercy, and for God's sake keep it quiet. We aren't here to wake up the town." A ripple of cruel laughter moved through the hunters. "That's disgusting," Harold breathed, his knuckles white around his rifle grip. "These aren't hunters, they're butchers." "They're worse," Jerry whispered, capturing every face with his digital recorder. "They're bored, and they're about to let their guard down." Jerry shifted his focus to the control panel near the bay door. It was hooked into the facility's main network, the same one he had been tracking from his basement. He pulled out a hardline cable and jacked it into the panel. "I'm bypassing their internal security," Jerry whispered. "I'm not just disabling the cameras, I'm unlocking the containment cells." "You're going to arm the victims?" Harold asked, his eyebrow arched. "I'm going to give them a fighting chance," Jerry said, his fingers flying across the keys. "I'm uploading the facility schematics to the internal server. Every prisoner is going to get a map and a weapon location on their personal comms device, which I know they let them keep for the tracking aspect of the game." "That's a bold move, Jerry. That's going to turn this place into a slaughterhouse." "Exactly," Jerry replied, his eyes cold as he hit the execute key. "The hunters want a game. Let's show them what happens when the game changes to survivor takes all." Suddenly, an alarm blared, a low, rhythmic thrumming sound that vibrated through the floorboards. On the control panel screen, a red warning flashed: "External breach detected, perimeter gate 4." Perez stopped his speech. He looked up, his predatory eyes scanning the atrium. "We have company," he growled, pulling his sidearm. "Find them, and don't bother bringing them back alive." Harold and Jerry exchanged a look. There was no more stealth. The clock was running and they were the targets. "We have to move," Harold said, checking his magazine. "Now." "Where to?" Jerry asked, scrambling up as heavy boots began to thunder in their direction. "To the cells," Harold said, pointing toward the dark labyrinthine hallways leading deeper into the complex. "We finish what we started, and we start by turning those victims into our new recruits." They took off, running into the bowels of the facility, the sound of the guards' boots close behind them. The game had just shifted, and the hunters were about to realize that they hadn't just invited a journalist and a SEAL into their arena. They'd invited a revolution. Chapter 4. The Uprising. The corridor was a claustrophobic vein of brushed steel and flickering halogen lights. Jerry's lungs burned, a sharp metallic sting that tasted of adrenaline and dust. Behind them, the rhythmic thump, thump, thump of combat boots echoed against the grating, a pursuit that was gaining speed. "They're closing in," Harold growled, his voice stripped of all emotion, replaced by the cold, tactical focus of a man who had spent his life in the kill zone. He didn't look back. He was counting footsteps, calculating distance. "Take the next left. It should lead to the secondary storage intake." "The cells are another 50 yards, Jerry gasped, his fingers fumbling as he clutched the tablet to his chest. He was sweating, his shirt clinging to his back. This wasn't journalism anymore. This was war, and he was the one who had pulled the pin on the grenade. "Move!" Harold shoved Jerry toward the corridor junction, and not a second too soon. A volley of suppressed gunfire chewed up the drywall where Jerry had been standing a heartbeat before. Dust and plaster exploded into the air, creating a chaotic fog. Harold didn't run away. He stopped, pivoted, and dropped to one knee. He unleashed a short, controlled burst from his MP5. The silence of the facility was shattered by the pop, pop, pop of his suppressed weapon, followed by the wet thud of a body hitting the floor. "One down," Harold muttered, rising as fluidly as he dropped. "Keep moving. I've got the rear." Jerry scrambled down the final stretch, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He reached the heavy reinforced bulkhead doors labeled Sector 4 Containment. This was it, the belly of the beast. He jammed his interface cable into the port next to the keypad. His fingers flew across the digital keys, his mind racing through the encryption protocols Stryker had installed. Come on, he urged the screen. The screen flickered. A line of green text scrolled by access, granted. With a heavy mechanical groan, the massive hydraulic locks disengaged. The door slid open with a hiss of pressurized air, revealing a long, dimly lit chamber filled with rows of glass-walled cells. The sight inside stopped Jerry dead in his tracks. It wasn't a prison. It was an aquarium for human misery. Some of the cells were empty, signs of the game already concluded. Others were occupied by terrified people, a nurse from the local clinic, a delivery driver, a teenager who looked no older than 16. They huddled in corners, their faces gaunt, eyes wide with the hollow look of those who had accepted their imminent death. "Get him up!" Harold hissed, sliding in beside Jerry and sweeping the room with his rifle. "We're out of time." Jerry didn't need to be told twice. He tapped a final command into his tablet, broadcasting a signal to every device he could find in the room, the ones the captives had been forced to carry. "Listen to me," Jerry shouted, his voice echoing in the chamber. "The doors are open. You have a chance to live. Grab whatever you can. Use the tools, the debris, anything. The guards are coming, but they aren't expecting you to be armed." For a second there was only silence. Then a flicker of understanding, and then rage ignited in the eyes of the captives. The teenager in the first cell, a kid who looked like he'd been through hell, surged forward, grabbing a heavy metal fire extinguisher from the wall. The nurse followed, picking up a jagged piece of metal from a broken chair. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly from paralysis to predation. Suddenly, the corridor behind them exploded with noise. Perez and his men had reached the doorway. A grenade bounced into the room, trailing smoke. "Get down!" Harold roared, tackling Jerry into the cover of a reinforced support column. The explosion shook the floor, throwing shrapnel across the room. The air filled with acrid smoke. Through the haze, the heavy tactical figures of the hunters surged into the room, rifles raised. "Clear the room!" Perez screamed, his voice booming over the chaos. "Leave no one standing!" But they weren't walking into a room of victims anymore. As the smoke cleared, the hunters found themselves staring into the eyes of 20 desperate, angry people who had nothing left to lose. Jerry watched, horrified and fascinated, as the teenager lunged from the shadows, swinging the extinguisher with the force of a desperate man. He collided with the lead guard, bringing him down in a tangle of limbs and tactical gear. A roar went up from the other cells. It wasn't the sound of prey being slaughtered, it was the sound of a counterattack. Harold stood up, his weapon leveled. "Now, Jerry!" He opened fire, his shots precise, taking out the guards who were trying to track the uprising. Jerry, abandoning his tablet, pulled his Glock and joined the fray, aiming not for the guards but for the light rig above the room. One shot, two shots. The massive industrial lights shattered, plunging the atrium into a chaotic strobe of emergency red lighting. In the darkness, the playing field leveled. The hunters, trained for a sport against cowering prey, were suddenly faced with a guerrilla insurgency. Perez let out a howl of frustration, firing his rifle blindly into the gloom. "Formation! Circle up!" "They're losing their nerve," Harold whispered, a grim smile touching his lips. "They wanted a hunt. We're giving them a war." Jerry looked at the chaos, the flashes of gunfire, the desperate screams of the victims turned warriors, the panic in the eyes of the wealthy killers who suddenly realized the power dynamic had completely inverted. "We need to get them to the armory," Jerry shouted to Harold over the din of battle. "If they get weapons, this game ends tonight." "Lead the way," Harold replied, firing another burst that silenced a hunter attempting to flank them. "I'll keep them off your back." They fought their way out of the cell block, the uprising raging behind them. Every step they took, the facility seemed to grow louder, more violent. The preserve was no longer a hunting ground. It was a cage, and the animals they had tried to break were finally, lethally, awake. Chapter 5. Turning the Tables. The corridor leading toward the armory was a masterpiece of cold industrial design. Brushed steel walls, reinforced flooring, and absolutely no cover. It was a kill box, a design choice Stryker had undoubtedly made to ensure his guests couldn't reach the heavy ordnance. But Stryker hadn't accounted for the fact that Harold Evans spent 20 years learning how to exploit kill boxes. "Move fast, low profile," Harold instructed, his voice barely a whisper. He checked the hallway ahead, his HUK MP5 raised. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and the distant, sickening sounds of the facility's descent into anarchy screams, the erratic staccato of gunfire, and the heavy metallic clang of doors being battered down. Jerry kept his head down, clutching the tablet. He was breathing hard, the adrenaline spike from the cell block breach beginning to fade into a cold, hard focus. "The armory is behind the primary bulkhead. It's biometric, Harold. Stryker's thumbprint." "We don't need his thumb," Harold replied, darting across the hallway and pressing his back against a utility door. "We just need to fool the sensor. Can you bypass it?" "I'm working on it," Jerry said, his fingers flying across the tablet's interface. He wasn't just hacking the door, he was hacking the entire facility's nervous system. Suddenly, a door halfway down the hall hissed open. A man in full tactical gear wearing the insignia of the hunters, a stylized wolf's head, stumbled out. He was clutching his arm, blood seeping through his fingers. He looked terrified. He wasn't looking for a fight, he was looking for an exit. He stopped dead when he saw Jerry and Harold. The hunter's eyes went wide and he reached for his pistol. Harold didn't hesitate. He didn't even aim. He moved with the muscle memory of a machine. A single suppressed shot barked and the hunter crumpled, his weapon skittering across the floor. Harold stepped over the body, checked the pulse, and shook his head. "One of their elites. Looks like the rabbit got a bite in on him." Jerry didn't look at the body. He was staring at his screen. "I've got the bypass code. Stryker's system is arrogant, Harold. He never updated the default override protocols from the construction phase. It's like leaving the front door key under the mat." He tapped the screen one last time. "Access granted." The heavy bulkhead door groaned and slid open. Inside, it looked like a small-scale military depot. Rows of R-15s, racks of combat knives, body armor, and crates of ammunition lined the walls. It was enough firepower to take down a small militia. "Jackpot," Harold said, stepping inside and instantly swapping his MP5 for a tactical AR-15. He tossed a vest to Jerry. "Put that on. It won't stop a rifle round at point blank, but it'll keep you in the fight." As Jerry buckled into the vest, the facility's internal speakers crackled to life. A voice filled the armory, smooth, cultured, and terrifyingly calm. "Gentlemen," Richard Stryker's voice echoed throughout the bunker, "I must say, I am impressed. Most of the prey I invite here spend their final hours begging, not hacking. You've turned my little game into a delightful tactical exercise. But let's be clear, you are guests in my home, and guests who break the furniture tend to be evicted." Jerry stopped, looking up at the ceiling. "He's watching us." "Of course he is," Harold growled, loading a fresh magazine into his rifle. "He's been watching us since we stepped over the fence. He's probably sitting in a command chair somewhere, sipping scotch, waiting to see how long we last before Perez kills us." "Mr. Rodriguez," Stryker's voice purred, closer now as if he were whispering into their ears. The game is no longer about hunting. It's about attrition. I've locked the facility down. The vents are venting halon gas in 10 minutes. If you're still inside, you'll be sleeping soundly for a very long time. Unless, of course, you find the override. I suggest you hurry. But gas, Jerry said, his mind racing. He's going to flush the whole place. He's willing to kill his own hunters just to stop us. He doesn't care about his hunters, Harold said, his face tightening with a mix of fury and understanding. To him, they're just another part of the disposable equipment. We aren't fighting for a win anymore, Jerry. We're fighting to keep breathing. Harold turned, his gaze locking onto Jerry. We need to get to the main control hub. It's the only place to shut down the ventilation and open the emergency exits. Where is it? Jerry pulled up the facility schematics on his tablet. His face went pale. It's on the lower level, in the heart of the facility, past the atrium. The atrium, Harold repeated, where Perez is regrouping. Yeah, Jerry said, checking his watch. 9 minutes, 40 seconds until the halon hits. Then we have exactly 9 minutes to kill our way to the center of the labyrinth, Harold said, racking the charging handle of his rifle with a metallic clack. It's been a while since I cleared a room that big. You ready to be the bait, Jerry? Jerry gripped the rifle, feeling the weight of it, the cold, hard reality of what he had to do. I'm not the bait, Harold. I'm the one pulling the trigger this time. They moved out of the armory, the sound of the facility's sirens beginning to wail a rhythmic screeching herald of their impending deadline. The preserve had become a pressure cooker, and Jerry and Harold were the only ones who knew how to stop it from exploding. They hit the corridor running, the sound of their boots the only rhythm that mattered. The game was over. The war had begun. Chapter 6: The Cathedral of Violence. 6 minutes and 40 seconds, Harold muttered, his voice cold and clipped. The facility's PA system was no longer playing ambient music. It was counting down. A flat, synthesized female voice droned through the corridors, counting down the time until the halon gas would displace the oxygen in the entire complex. Atmospheric depressurization sequence initiated. 5 minutes, 50 seconds to total saturation. They were sprinting down the catwalks overlooking the atrium. Below them, the facility was a graveyard of broken dreams and shattered steel. Bodies of the hunters and the freed victims lay scattered, a testament to the brutal uprising that had turned the game into a slaughter. And in the center of the atrium, standing near the main control hub terminal, was Elijah the Wolf Perez. He wasn't running. He wasn't panicking. He stood with his legs planted wide, his rifle raised, waiting. He had 6 men left, a professional security detail, not the hobbyist hunters who had been picked off in the confusion. He's waiting for us, Jerry whispered, pulling up behind a reinforced pillar. His chest was heaving. He was a journalist, not a marathon runner, and his legs felt like lead. He's guarding the console. We can't get to the shut-off switch with him sitting on it. He thinks he's playing King of the Hill, Harold replied, checking his AR-15. He's a soldier, Jerry. He knows we're coming for the console. He's going to make us pay for every inch. How do we clear him out? Harold looked at the layout. The catwalks gave them the high ground, but it was an exposed position. One well-placed burst from below would shred them. We don't clear him. We distract him. I'm going to draw their fire from the east catwalk. You move down the service ladder, slide into the maintenance trench, and flank him. Get to that terminal. Harold, that's suicide, Jerry said, grabbing Harold's sleeve. You'll be a sitting duck. I'm a professional, Jerry. I'm the best decoy they've ever seen, Harold said, his eyes locking onto Jerry's with a familiar, terrifying calmness. When I open fire, you move. Don't think. Don't hesitate. I just get to the console. If you don't, we're both breathing gas in 5 minutes. Harold didn't wait for a rebuttal. He surged up from behind the pillar, his AR-15 roaring to life. The thud, thud, thud of his rifle fire was rhythmic, precise. He laid down a wall of suppression that forced Perez and his men to dive for cover. Harold screamed. Jerry scrambled. He threw himself onto the service ladder, the metal biting into his palms as he descended with reckless speed. Above him, the catwalk became a symphony of violence. Bullets sparked against the steel gratings, showering Jerry in sparks and debris. He hit the floor of the atrium, scrambled into the shadows of the maintenance trench, and sprinted toward the main terminal. He could hear the fight above him. It was primal. It was the sound of a SEAL who refused to quit against a mercenary who refused to lose. Jerry reached the console, his breath coming in jagged gasps. He looked up. Harold had abandoned the catwalk and was now on the ground, engaging Perez in a brutal close-quarters firefight. They were exchanging fire behind marble planters and heavy industrial pillars. Perez fired a burst that clipped Harold's shoulder, sending him spinning, but Harold didn't drop. He rolled, came up on one knee and fired back, shattering the glass of a display case that erupted in a spray of razor-sharp shards. "Jerry!" Harold roared over the sound of gunfire. "The console!" Jerry turned back to the terminal. His hands shook as he jacked his interface cable into the port. System access restricted. Halon release override locked. "It's locked!" Jerry shouted, his heart dropping into his stomach. "It's a biometric override. I can't bypass it without a physical key." Perez, hearing the shout, grinned. He kicked aside a piece of debris and aimed his weapon at Jerry. "Game over, journalist." He pulled the trigger, but before the round could leave the chamber, a heavy canister, a fire extinguisher Jerry had grabbed from the hull, flew through the air and slammed into Perez's wrist. The mercenary howled in pain, his shot going wide. It was Harold. He had thrown it with impossible accuracy. "Jerry, get to the floor!" Harold bellowed, charging Perez with nothing but a combat knife. The two men collided. It wasn't a fight, it was a collision of two apex predators. Perez was faster, a whirlwind of strikes and tactical kicks, but Harold was made of iron. He absorbed the blows, turning them into grappling opportunities, using his weight to pin the mercenary against the very console Jerry was trying to hack. "You're not so tough," Perez snarled, trying to draw a secondary pistol. "I'm the only one left," Harold grunted, slamming his head into Perez's nose. Jerry looked at the console, but then at the fight. He realized the physical key wasn't a keycard. It was a manual override lever hidden behind the control panel, a fail-safe for the facility's power grid. He ripped off the panel cover with his bare hands, ignoring the sharp edges that sliced into his skin. 1 minute to saturation, the computer announced. Jerry saw the lever. It was red, rusted, and stuck. He braced his feet against the console and pulled with every ounce of strength in his body. "Come on," he screamed, his muscles burning. With a sickening crack, the lever gave way. The sound of the ventilation fans changed instantly. The rhythmic, ominous whine of the gas system began to die down, replaced by a shuddering silence as the massive blowers ground to a halt. Perez, distracted by the sudden silence, looked up. It was the mistake Harold needed. Harold drove his knee into Perez's midsection, followed by a crushing strike that knocked the mercenary unconscious. The atrium went still. The only sound was the heavy, labored breathing of the two men. Harold stood over the unconscious form of the wolf, his shoulder soaked in blood, his face a mask of sweat and adrenaline. He looked at the console where Jerry stood trembling with the red lever pulled down. "You did it," Harold breathed, slumping against the terminal. "You stopped the gas." Jerry slid down the side of the console, his body finally giving up. They were alive, but they weren't out yet. "It's not over, Harold," Jerry said, staring at the screen. A new message had appeared on the main monitor, glowing in bright, taunting white text against the black background. "System override detected. Authorization Richard Stryker. Protocol self-destruct activated. Time to detonation 5 minutes." "He's not letting us leave," Jerry whispered, the blood draining from his face. "He's bringing the whole mountain down on top of us." Chapter 7. The Final Countdown. The countdown wasn't just a sound. It was a rhythmic, pulsing vibration that traveled through the soles of Jerry's boots. 4 minutes and 45 seconds. The entire facility groaned. A subterranean beast dying in the dark. Dust cascaded from the ceiling, and the emergency lights shifted from a pulsating red to a stark, blinding white strobe that made movement disorienting. Harold was already moving, dragging the unconscious form of Perez toward the reinforced supply locker. "Leave him!" Jerry shouted, his voice cracking. "We don't have time for prisoners." Harold didn't look back. He shoved the mercenary into the locker and slammed the heavy door shut, twisting the manual lock. He knows how this place works. If he wakes up and finds a self-destruct, he'll have a backup exit. I'm not letting him walk away from this. Harold grabbed his rifle and turned to Jerry, his face a grim mask of blood and grit. "The main exit is reinforced to survive a bunker buster. We aren't getting out that way. Where's the waste disposal line?" Jerry fumbled with the tablet, his fingers slippery with sweat. "The sanitation chute. It dumps out into the storm drain about 300 yards from the perimeter fence. It's tight. It's nasty, and it's a vertical drop, but it's the only way out before the ceiling caves in." "Move!" They bolted. As they hit the hallway, the facility's automated security systems, the ones that hadn't been triggered by the lockdown, suddenly roared to life. This wasn't human intervention. This was the cold, calculated logic of Stryker's central AI. From the ceiling, metallic panels retracted with a high-pitched whine. Sleek, quad-rotor drones descended, their LED eyes glowing a menacing singular blue. They weren't armed with rifles, they were equipped with high-velocity shockwire launchers and miniature thermite charges. "Contact! Ceiling, 12 o'clock!" Harold didn't stop running. He leveled his AR-15 and fired a sustained burst upward. The bullets sparked against the drone's titanium plating, doing little more than deflecting their aim. One of the drones spun, its shock wire snapping out like a whip. It struck the wall inches from Jerry's head, the electric discharge searing the paint and sending a shower of sparks over him. "They're autonomous!" Jerry yelled, diving behind a support pillar as another thermite charge hissed, burning a hole through the floor where he had been standing a second before. Strikers wiped their threat assessment logs. They aren't programmed to capture. They're programmed to incinerate. "I don't need them to think," Harold shouted. He slid across the polished floor, coming to a stop on his back, and fired a precision shot into the central rotor of the lead drone. It spiraled out of control, crashing into the next one in the sequence, causing a chain reaction of explosions that filled the corridor with blinding smoke. "Go, Jerry, get to the chute!" Jerry sprinted, his boots skidding on the slick concrete. The facility was literally tearing itself apart. Pipes burst in the walls, spraying high-pressure steam that hissed like angry snakes. The floor bucked beneath him as the first of the explosive charges Stryker's self-destruct protocol began to detonate in the lower levels. The sound was a deep guttural roar that vibrated in Jerry's chest. 3 minutes remaining. He reached the sanitation access hatch, a small circular door set into the floor near the back of the service corridor. He yanked the lever, but it was jammed. Panic surged in his throat. "It's stuck!" Harold was right behind him, firing at the remaining drones that were weaving through the smoke. He slammed into the floor beside Jerry, kicked the hatch with the heel of his boot, and heaved. The metal shrieked in protest, then gave way. Darkness yawned beneath them, a wet, narrow slide of concrete and grit. Harold shoved Jerry into the hole. "Down!" Jerry slid, tumbling through the cold, cramped chute. It was a dizzying, sickening drop that ended in a jarring splash into shallow, murky water. He scrambled to his feet, gasping for air, the smell of damp earth and rust overwhelming. Seconds later, Harold landed behind him, his tactical vest scraping against the concrete walls of the tunnel. "The tunnel leads north," Harold said, looking at the incline. "If my map is right, we hit a drainage grate in 3 minutes. We run, Jerry. We don't stop until we see daylight." They took off, splashing through the knee-deep water. The tunnel was long and dark, the only sound the frantic thumping of their hearts and the distant, muffled whump-whump of explosions from the facility behind them. 2 minutes. "Why is he doing this?" Jerry panted, his legs screaming for mercy. He's destroying billions of dollars in tech, destroying his own life's work. Why? Because he's a narcissist, Harold spat, his voice echoing in the tunnel. He'd rather burn his kingdom to the ground than let anyone else walk through his front door. He's not a businessman, Jerry. He's a child playing with a chemistry set, and we just broke his favorite toy. Suddenly, the tunnel vibrated violently. A chunk of concrete from the ceiling sheared off, crashing into the water just behind them. He's accelerating the sequence, Jerry shouted. 90 seconds. They saw a flicker of light ahead the drainage grate. It was rusted, reinforced with heavy rebar, but it was daylight. The sky was a pale, pre-dawn gray, the most beautiful thing Jerry had ever seen. Harold the Great. Harold didn't slow down. He took a grenade from his vest, pulled the pin, and tossed it toward the grate. Get down! They threw themselves into the muck of the tunnel floor, covering their heads. The explosion was deafening. The grate flew outward, twisted and torn, opening a gaping hole to the outside world. 60 seconds. They scrambled out of the tunnel, gasping for air, the cold morning wind hitting their faces like a slap. They were on the edge of the Westbridge Plains, a mile from where they'd parked the truck. Run, Harold commanded. They didn't look back. They ran across the open field, their lungs burning, their bodies shattered, but their pace was fueled by the sheer, desperate need to exist. Behind them, the ground seemed to swallow itself. The grain silos, the warehouses, the entire preserve imploded in a silent, terrifying ripple of earth and steel. A shockwave rippled out, knocking them both to their knees just as they reached the tree line. Silence followed, heavy and absolute. Jerry lay on his back, staring up at the darkening sky, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gulps. He looked at Harold, who was sitting up, checking his sidearm, his face smeared with dirt and dried blood. They had survived. But as Jerry watched the smoke plume rise into the morning air, he knew this wasn't the end. Stryker was still out there, and they had just started a war that the world wasn't ready to see. Chapter 8. The Ledger of Blood. The smoke from the crater was a black, oily smear against the dawn sky, a funeral pyre for a dozen secrets that were meant to die in the dark. Jerry Rodriguez stumbled through the underbrush, his chest heaving, his fingers raw and bloodied. Beside him, Harold Evans moved with a limping, practiced efficiency, his rifle held low but ready. They were miles from the facility, deep in the thicket of the Nebraska plains, but the silence of the morning felt like a physical weight. "They'll be looking for us," Harold grunted, stopping for a moment to lean against a cedar tree. He checked his sidearm, his breathing harsh and ragged. "Stryker's a creature of habit. He'll assume we died in the blast, but he'll sweep the perimeter within the hour to make sure. We need to disappear." Jerry pulled the tablet from his vest. The screen was cracked, spider-webbed with fractures, but the data, the precious, damning data he had ripped from the server, was still intact. "He thinks he burned everything, Harold. He'd burned the evidence, the bodies, the technology, but he forgot one thing. I synchronized the server to a cloud-based backup while I was hacking the terminal. Everything. The names, the bank accounts, the kill logs, it's all here." Harold looked at the screen, his expression unreadable. "Names?" "Everyone," Jerry said, a grim smile touching his lips. "The donors, the hunters, the politicians who looked the other way. It's a list of the most powerful predators in the world, and now I have their home addresses." Harold straightened up, the exhaustion momentarily vanishing from his eyes. "The table is turned then. We aren't the prey anymore. We're the auditors." They moved through the woods until they reached a nondescript, mud-caked sedan Harold had stashed near an old logging road. It was an hour's drive to Harold's retirement cabin, a remote, reinforced structure deep in the backcountry that hadn't seen a visitor in years. For the next 12 hours, the cabin became a war room. They cleaned their wounds with antiseptic and stitched each other up in grim, professional silence. When they were patched, they went to work. Jerry's tablet became the center of the universe. He spent hours filtering the data, cross-referencing IP addresses, bank transfers, and private encrypted messages. We start with the easy one, Jerry said, spinning the screen toward Harold. Harrison Vance, CEO of Vance Maritime. He funded the facility's construction and personally participated in 3 of the hunts last year. Harold studied the profile. Vance lived in a high-security estate on the coast of South Carolina. It was a fortress, just like the silo, but it was a different kind of trap. A maritime estate. Lots of windows, lots of open ground. He'll have private security, but they'll be standard corporate muscle, not mercenaries like Perez. He thinks he's safe, Jerry said. He thinks the incident at Westbridge was just a tragic gas leak that silenced his little playground. He has no idea we're coming for the ledger. They traveled light, moving under the cover of darkness. They didn't hit the estate with a bang. They hit it like a whisper. They infiltrated the estate's server room, bypassed the security grid, and turned the digital infrastructure against the inhabitants. At 3 a.m., Harrison Vance was sleeping in his master's suite when his phone, resting on his nightstand, began to vibrate. He woke with a start, groggy and annoyed. He checked the screen. Message received. Sender unknown. Text you're next. Vance went pale. He bolted upright, scanning the room. The house was silent, save for the hum of the air conditioning. He reached for his emergency panic button, the one connected to his private security team, but the display showed signal lost. He scrambled out of bed and rushed to his office, his heart hammering in his throat. He sat at his computer, his hands shaking as he typed in his override codes. Nothing. The screen flickered, and then a single image filled the monitor, a high-resolution photo of the interior of his own panic room taken 10 seconds ago. Vance grabbed his handgun from the desk, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Message: we saw what you did at Westbridge, Harrison. He turned to run, but the door to his office hissed open. Harold Evans stood there, his face shadowed, his rifle raised with lethal, calm precision. Vance didn't speak. He couldn't. The terror in his eyes was absolute, a mirror of the fear he had inflicted on so many others. You hunted them, Harold said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that seemed to vibrate in the room. You treated them like sport. You thought your money made you a god. Harold stepped forward, the barrel of his rifle inches from Vance's chest. I'm not a hunter, Harrison. I'm a soldier, and I'm here to collect the debt. Jerry stood behind Harold, his fingers flying across his own handheld terminal. It's done, Harold. I've drained his accounts, sent the proof of his involvement to every major news outlet in the country, and locked the estate's security doors from the outside. By morning, the police will be here and he'll have nowhere to go. Vance crumpled to the floor, his weapon clattering uselessly away. He was broken, no longer a titan of industry, but a pathetic, terrified man who had finally realized that his time had run out. One down, Jerry said, closing his tablet. And the rest? Harold asked, glancing at the long list of names still displayed on the screen. We go down the list, Jerry replied. Stryker is the head of the snake, but if we cut off the body, he'll have nowhere to hide. We're going to make sure every single one of them experiences the terror they sold to others. They left the estate as the first light of dawn touched the horizon. They were tired, battered, and hunted themselves, but for the first time in their lives they were in control. The silence of the morning didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt like the calm before the storm. Stryker was still out there, hiding in his ivory tower, believing he had won. He had no idea that his empire was crumbling. His associates were being picked off, and his own digital ghosts were being used to pave his road to ruin. To the next one? Harold asked, starting the car. To the next one, Jerry confirmed. The war had gone global, and they were the only ones holding the map. Chapter 9. The Architect's Last Stand. The Swiss Alps were silent, save for the biting wind that howled around the jagged peaks. Perched on a cliffside, miles from the nearest road, Richard Stryker's private sanctuary was a marvel of glass and reinforced steel, an architectural ego trip designed to keep the world out. Inside, the lights were dimmed to a soft, ambient glow. Stryker sat in a leather armchair, a glass of 30-year-old scotch in his hand. watching the fire crackle in the hearth. He wasn't watching the news, but he knew what was happening. His phone, a custom, military-grade device, had been silent for 3 hours. The network of his associates, the elite hunters, had gone dark one by one. His bank accounts had been frozen, his offshore assets vaporized, and his reputation was currently being shredded by the global media. He wasn't afraid. Fear was a chemical reaction for the small-minded. He was merely annoyed. He had underestimated the tenacity of 2 discarded men. He looked up at the wall of floor-to-ceiling windows. The night was pitch black, a void that pressed against the glass. Click! The lock on the heavy, biometric-secured front door disengaged, not with a forced explosion but with the quiet, electronic hiss of a system accepting a master override. Stryker didn't stand. He didn't reach for the handgun hidden beneath the cushion of his chair. He simply swirled his scotch, watching as the shadows in the hallway coalesced into 2 figures. Jerry Rodriguez walked in first, his clothes torn and stained with the grime of the journey, his face hard as granite. Behind him was Harold Evans, looking like a phantom of war, his rifle leveled at Stryker's chest. "You took your time," Stryker said, his voice smooth, unaffected. "I expected you to be caught in the avalanche of lawsuits by now. I suppose you didn't get the memo that the game is over." "The game is over for you, Richard," Jerry said, his voice cold. He didn't rush. He didn't look for a weapon. He simply walked to the fireplace and placed his tablet on the mantel. "I've spent months looking for a motive," Jerry continued, pacing the room. "I thought you were a sociopath. I thought you were just bored. But you're not even that interesting. You're just a man who realized that in a world where everyone is connected, the ultimate luxury is total control. You wanted to know what it felt like to decide who lives and who dies without the interference of law or morality." Stryker smiled. "And it felt divine, Jerry. Should try it sometime. The feeling of absolute sovereignty, it ruins everything else. Nothing else tastes quite as sweet." Harold stepped forward, the barrel of his rifle pressing firmly against Stryker's temple. The billionaire's smile faltered, just for a fraction of a second. "I'm not here to debate philosophy," Harold growled. "I'm here to finish the contract." "Contract?" Stryker let out a dry laugh. "You're vigilantes. You're ghosts. You don't have a contract. If you kill me, you're just murderers. And you'll spend the rest of your lives looking over your shoulder waiting for the people I hired to avenge me to find you." "They won't be coming," Jerry said. He picked up his phone and slid it across the table towards Stryker. Stryker looked down at the device. It was vibrating. "Sender unknown. Message received. Text you're next." The color drained from Stryker's face. He looked up, his eyes wide, the mask of the untouchable visionary finally cracking. "How?" "We didn't just leak your secrets," Jerry said, leaning in close. "We turned your own app against you. Every person you've wronged, every family that lost a loved one in your preserve, they all have the location of this bunker, and they know exactly what you did." Stryker looked at the windows. He realized then that the silence outside wasn't just the wind, it was the sound of something else. "You didn't kill me," Stryker whispered, his voice trembling. "You turned me into the prey." "It's a cruel game, isn't it?" Jerry asked. "Being hunted. Knowing that at any second someone is coming through that door to take everything from you. You're not a god, Richard. You're just a man who ran out of time." Harold pulled back the hammer of his rifle. "We're done here, Jerry. He's got nowhere to run. The police are 10 minutes out. Let the world handle him." "No," Jerry said, his eyes burning. "He doesn't get to go to a courtroom. He doesn't get to sit in a cell and write a book about his genius. He needs to experience exactly what he dealt out." Jerry walked to the door, Harold following close behind. As they reached the exit, Jerry paused and turned back. "The timer is set, Richard," Jerry said. "Try to enjoy the hunt." They stepped out into the night, the cold mountain air refreshing against their skin. As they walked toward their extraction vehicle, they heard a frantic, panicked cry from inside the villa. The sound of a man who realized the doors were locked, The alarms were triggered, and he was finally truly alone in the dark. The most dangerous game had ended, and for the first time in a long time the world was silent. Epilogue. The long shadow. The world didn't end with a bang, nor did it end with a whimper. It ended with a news cycle. For 3 weeks the story of the preserve dominated every screen, every headline, and every conversation on the planet. The data that Jerry had meticulously harvested, the names of the hunters, the financial routes of the shell companies, the horrific evidence of the hunts had functioned like a digital EMP. It didn't just shut down a criminal enterprise, it scorched the earth around it. Richard Stryker didn't die that night in his Swiss villa. He lived. But he didn't live as the man he once was. The police had found him huddled in the corner of his panic room, not because he was protecting himself from intruders, but because he was paralyzed by the constant, relentless pinging of his own phone. Thousands of messages, thousands of reminders, all echoing the same phrase: "You're next." When the Swiss authorities kicked down the door, they found a man who had seemingly aged 20 years in a single night, a broken, weeping husk of a billionaire who had lost his empire, his status, and his mind. He didn't make it to trial. The secrets he possessed were too dangerous for too many people. He was found dead in his holding cell 3 months later. Suicide, the report said. The truth was likely far more complicated, but in the world of high-stakes shadows, the truth rarely mattered as much as the silence. But for Jerry and Harold, the world had changed in more subtle, profound ways. They had vanished before the police even breached the villa perimeter. They had driven through the night, crossing the border into a neutral territory, their faces obscured by the shadows and the sheer anonymity of the road. They met one final time, a year later, in a nondescript diner on the outskirts of a city neither of them would name. The rain was lashing against the windows, a persistent, rhythmic drumming that reminded Jerry of the pulse of the silo's alarm system, a sound that still woke him up in a cold sweat some nights. Harold looked different. The military posture was still there, the steel in his spine unchanged, but there was a weariness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. He had grown a beard, and he dressed in the nondescript clothes of a man who didn't want to be noticed. He was a ghost, just as he had always trained to be. "I saw the news," Harold said, not looking at Jerry but staring out the window at the gray, rain-slicked street. "The authorities finally shut down the last of the shell companies. The Apex Instinct brand is dead. You did good work, Jerry." "We did," Jerry corrected, stirring his black coffee. "I just pushed the keys, Harold. You kept the wolves away from the gate." "They're not wolves," Harold replied, his voice flat. "They were just men with too much money and not enough purpose, and now they're just men in cages." Jerry pulled his collar up. He had spent the last year ghost writing for a small, independent outlet, using his skills to expose corporate corruption. He wasn't chasing ghosts anymore. He was chasing light. But the adrenaline of that night, the fear, the fight, the cold satisfaction of the hunt never truly left him. It was a scar, a part of who he was now. "Do you ever think about it?" Jerry asked. "The message? You're next?" Harold finally turned to look at him. His eyes were hard, but there was a flicker of something. Maybe empathy. Maybe just shared history behind the gaze. "Every day. But that's the thing about being hunted, Jerry. It changes you. You stop being the prey and you start realizing that the only way to survive is to never let them catch you again." Harold reached into his jacket and pulled out a small encrypted thumb drive, sliding it across the table. "I scrubbed the last of the digital footprint. There's nothing left. No servers, no backups, no connection between us and the fall of Stryker's house of cards. We're ghosts, Jerry. Let's stay that way." Jerry looked at the drive, then at Harold. He realized that this was a goodbye. They were two men who had shared the most intense moment of their lives, and now they were being pulled back into the isolation that had defined them before the text message had ever arrived. "Where will you go?" Jerry asked. Harold stood up, putting on his coat. He looked like any other man in a crowded diner, unremarkable, forgotten. "Nowhere in particular, just away." He turned and walked toward the door, disappearing into the rain. Jerry watched him go, a sense of finality settling in his chest. He looked down at his phone. It was an old model, stripped of GPS, stripped of cloud syncing, stripped of anything that could be tracked. It sat on the table, silent, dark, and utterly peaceful. Jerry realized then that the terror of the "Your Next" message hadn't been about the text itself. It had been about the illusion of safety, the belief that the world was a predictable place where you could go to sleep and wake up in the same life you left. That illusion was gone, shattered forever. He stood up, left a $20 bill on the table, and walked out into the rain. He didn't look back at the diner. He didn't check the rearview mirror. He just merged into the stream of traffic, a single car among millions, disappearing into the vast, indifferent tapestry of the world. He was no longer the prey. He was no longer the hunter. He was simply free. And as he drove, the phone in his pocket remained silent. For the first time in his life, that silence wasn't empty. It was the sound of a future he had finally earned.
Thank you for listening to Your Next, a Shiver Audiobooks production. We've traveled a long way together, from the quiet, unsuspecting streets of Westbridge City to the dark, adrenaline-fueled heart of the Preserve, and finally into the private, obsidian fortress of a man who thought he could play God with our lives. Jerry and Harold's journey reminds us that in a world where the elite believe they can treat human beings like disposable game, the most dangerous thing you can encounter is a man with nothing left to lose. The hunt has ended. The masters have finally become the prey, and the truth, the raw, unfiltered truth, has finally been dragged out into the light. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, please consider leaving a like and sharing the video. It's the best way to help our channel grow and ensures we can keep bringing these high-stakes, cinematic worlds to life. A massive thank you to our subscribers. You are the ones who keep the signal alive. Without your support, these stories will remain buried in the silence of the system, hidden away where the powerful want them to stay. Before you go, let us know in the comments. If you received a message that changed your life, would you run to save yourself, or would you turn around and hunt down the person behind the screen? Is the truth worth the risk of becoming a target? Until the next file is decrypted, stay alert, stay curious, and always watch your back.